So it's an excellent report. I mean, the key factor I think that they're showing is that we could have as large as a 50% hit to GDP by 2070. One of the key authors of this report from Exeter University is, of course, Timothy Lenton, who's well known for his research on tipping points.
Welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum program. We're happy to be with you today. We've been with you for over 200 previous episodes covering almost every aspect of the climate emergency. And today we'll be talking about a new concept, or at least a new term, planetary solvency, or some might wonder whether it's really planetary insolvency. But we'll be focusing on a really important report that was issued recently called Planetary Solvency: Finding Our Balance with Nature. I think this report breaks some new ground, even though perhaps that ground should have been broken a long time ago, but better late than never. I'm Herb Simmens. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future and a co-founder of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. We would hope that if you like this program, that you will like it on YouTube, that you will share it with your friends and colleagues, that you will subscribe to our channel, that you would leave some comments and forward this video to your friends and colleagues and neighbors or so. There's a few topics more important than dealing with the climate emergency, and that's all we deal with here on this channel. So with that, I'm going to start by turning it over to our regular panelist, Dr. Peter Carter. Peter, as many of you know, is a retired medical doctor, the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute, an expert reviewer for the IPCC, and a longtime devotee of climate science and all of its manifestations. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Herb. And thank you for pointing out that we're covering ground here that was broken a long time ago. So there's really actually nothing new here. But it's very, very useful and valuable that the authors have been pretty definite on some things that are most important that generally the scientists are not definite on. I disagree that this leads to a possibility for avoiding insolvency, which is stated over and over in this report. So I disagree with that. And also, that we can still get a balance in nature. I mean, from my point of view, we've been out of balance for nature for decades. But there we are. There are important things in this report, as I say. Now, risk, of course, is the likelihood of something bad happening and the magnitude of the bad thing. So I'm happy that this report focuses, therefore, on tipping points. And also, it's got this great diagram from a paper that was quite recently published showing the interaction and cascading awful total impacts of tipping points having been reached, exceeded. And so the paper says quite definitely that we are now over 1.5 degrees C. So I'm very happy to hear that because we're not hearing that very much. And they say it's implying an overshoot of periscope. Yeah, but we've actually been sort of relying on overshooting our danger limits for a long time. And that's dangerous talk. It says, points out we have an ongoing increase in emissions, yes, and an increase in greenhouse gas levels, yes. So those are really absolutely key in doing a risk assessment. They say our risk trajectory is red, so they agree with WMO's code red of last year. Now, this is very important. They say that the tipping point's risks increase exponentially once we're at 1.5 degrees C. So there we are. This is the real crucial thing for this report, right? We're above 1.5 degrees C. So we're in a situation in which risks are already increasing exponentially. The emissions and greenhouse gas levels, the report says, indicates more than 2 degrees C. So that's good. You see, these things are really, really clear and definite here. And that's great. I want to mention I like to follow the late Herman Daly and use ecological economics when thinking about these terms. I want to mention his great work. The other thing that I do, I've been doing this for forever, is focusing on what are committed global warming and climate change is, not what we're at today, what is committed in the future. Because, of course, it's the future that matters because we have an obligation to have a legacy of a decent planet for our children, and already they're not getting that. So, commitment is at least 2.4 degrees C. And that's from the great Hansen last year's paper on the global warming in the pipe. So it's actually more than that because that doesn't include the time it's going to take once we make a decision to put global emissions into rapid decline, as the sixth assessment of the IPCC says. So you have to add that time and that warming to the 2.4 degrees C. We're really in a very, very bad situation. And of course, governments, and particularly new governments, are not making that any better. They're making it way worse. So that's all I'll say about that. I think my point is that it's great to choose tipping points as your sort of metric for risk. Go for the greatest risks first. But we really do have to be realistic, and we're way beyond insolvency. Just a couple of things, finally. We're in insolvent Earth footprint, what the footprint network has been doing for a long time. Plus, and we are relying on 1.7 Earths. Really 2 Earths is how we're working. Right. And the other thing is, on top of that, as I've already mentioned, the scientists and policymakers are relying on the success of an overshoot, which relies totally on removing massive amounts of carbon dioxide. That's a fantasy.
Thank you, Peter. Your comment about we're probably in insolvency rather than solvency, and that the report maybe was a little heavy on hope reminded me of what a climate writer who's published in a lot of articles once said, where every time he submitted an article about climate that was realistic, he'd get back a note from his editors saying, well, okay, everything you said is accurate and scientifically valid, but you need to have the last paragraph end with hope. You can't, you can't leave people without hope. That was sort of the sense I got from this otherwise wonderful and a groundbreaking, again, if maybe a decade too late, a groundbreaking report. Before I turn it over to Paul Beckwith, I wanted just to make a couple of additional comments that I think this paper is very, very courageous in being brutally honest about the inadequacy, if not misleading nature of many of the economic projections of the impacts of climate change. And, usually you don't find such sharp criticism, which I think is entirely valid. And I just wanted to read one quote from the paper. They were referring to one assessment that said by the end of the century, if things are really bad, we might have a 15% reduction in GDP. The paper then says, quote, this is analogous to carrying out a risk assessment of the impact of the Titanic hitting an iceberg, but excluding from our model the possibility that the ship could sink, that there's a shortage of lifeboats, and that death from drowning or hypothermia may occur. The model results would be reassuring but dangerous, as they severely understate the level of risk. And yet, this is what the kinds of information that have gone to climate decision makers and the public saying, well, it's not so bad. We can make up for a few percent here or there. I think to me, that's perhaps the most important message in this document. And it came from the actuarial profession in conjunction with some very well-known scientists like Tim Lenton or so. So with that, I'm always happy to introduce Paul Beckwith. Paul, as most of you know, is a climate system scientist in Ottawa at the University of Ottawa and is the prolific YouTube convener and author and commentator with over 1,000 videos. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Paul.
Yes, thank you, Herb, and thanks, Peter. So I agree with Herb that it's nice to see plain and straight language in a report, and even in the title, Planetary Solvency, is bringing up the idea that, are we in such a thing or are we already past tipping points and are we already well on the slippery slope downwards in terms of, economic viability of our societies, et cetera. So it's an excellent report. I mean, the key factor I think that they're showing is that we could have as large as a 50% hit to GDP by 2070. One of the key authors of this report from Exeter University is, of course, Timothy Lenton, who's well known for his research on tipping points over decades. In fact, I remember reading a paper of his from 2012. I think it was published, Global Tipping Points in the Climate System and things like that. He's published a lot on this area. This is his area of expertise. And then teaming up with actuarial people, number crunchers, I think is very significant to try to get the financial aspects. It is pretty clear, as Peter pointed out, that we're over 1.5. According to Hansen, he put out a short report just a few days ago, and he's arguing that, yeah, 2025 is sort of the acid test for their work on whether it's the sulfur emissions that have caused a jump of point, zero point 0.4 degrees, or at least half of that jump, the other half being to the relatively weak El Nino that we had, or ENSO. So we're there already. He thinks for 2025 we could actually exceed the 2023, 2024 numbers, but more likely will be settled around 1.5 still. I would like to note that January was 1.75 and February is a bit cooler, but we'll know a lot more by the end of this year. I wouldn't bet against Hansen and his group on anything. I read a very interesting report on article in Inside Climate News where there was an interview with Timothy Lenton on the actual Exeter University report. His personal interview, he talks about his 14, 15-year-old children and how they'll certainly be affected by things in 2070. He talked a bit about the motivation for why he does his work, and it's the same for many people. It's for our children, it's for, we want human society to continue, and people are very worried that that may not happen. And another very, if you want to really look, like climate scientists for years have been trying to raise the alarm. Look at Hansen in Congress in 1988. Unfortunately, they haven't had too much headway. And a number of scientists that worked in research in universities were recruited by the reinsurance industry. And this is the industry of massive reinsurance companies that they insure the insurance companies. Think of the California wildfires, massive fires going through a section of California. Many people have their houses insured with the same companies. Those companies take a huge hit and would go bankrupt without these reinsurance companies to support them and spread the risk. Some other huge events, we're getting a litany of these all the time. I mean, think of the Valencia floods in Spain. Think of the Hurricane Helene damage throughout the Appalachians. Think of electricity grids that are failing. Entire countries are losing electricity in big, massive failures. Cuba, I believe, has, last year it was very horrible for Cuba. And in fact, I think the grid's out again, in places like that, Puerto Rico, many, many places, entire countries are losing electrical grids. And think about losing your electrical power. It basically drives us back to the Stone Ages. So it's very interesting. I'll talk in my second tranche of discussion, I think I'll focus more on what actually the reinsurance companies have done, what their role is in the history of climate change and what they're doing today. Because people may not want to listen to scientists and about the physics or chemistry of the atmosphere, the technical background and information on climate change, but they'll certainly listen to people that are in the financial industry, and the reinsurance companies have been on the ball on climate change for many, many years, but nobody kind of acknowledges that or listens to them either, really.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for highlighting the role of the reinsurance industry. A couple of comments that I also on the report itself, as you mentioned, Tim Lenton is one of the preeminent climate scientists and probably the preeminent climate scientist when it comes to tipping points. And he has always been, as far as I could see, fairly resistant to opening up the door potentially for solar radiation modification or geoengineering. And in this report, there is a bullet that recommends additional research on SRM, and he is a signatory and an author of this report. So I think it's an important indication. And for those of you watching our programs, you'll know that we had a number of programs from Baku that focused on solar radiation management. And before then, Paul has had a number of programs in his channel as well. So I think this is an important recognition that we can't rely on emission reductions alone. And speaking of tipping points and Tim Lenton, they at Exeter University in the southwest of England, they're having their second global tipping point conference at the end of June, the last week in June. And they just announced yesterday or the day before that registration is open for those of you who are in England or can get there or interested. This will bring together, almost all the world's leading tipping point experts. So I encourage you, and there is a virtual option to participate virtually for a considerably lower cost than attending in person. So I think this is really, really significant. Before I turn it back to Peter, I just wanted to read one thing from my book that goes into the same theme, I think, of the, which is not meant in any way to denigrate the scientific progress and the scientists themselves, but Jim Hansen did come up with the term scientific reticence. And in my book, I'm going to read the first couple chapters from my description of it because I think it's relevant to what this report says as well. It says scientists, by their training and culture, tend to be quite cautious in proclaiming the significance of a finding or in discussing the practical real-world consequence of their research. This can result in a perception of climate breakdown as manageable, even if the actual studies suggest a much more dire outlook. As a result, the public and decision makers may not be getting the full story of the magnitude and likelihood of severe climate impacts. Using technical jargon, sprinkling the word may in every conclusion, asserting the obligatory more study is needed, waiting for months until publication in an obscure journal before sending out a press release may all be standard practices when one is researching the history of religious artifacts in 5th century Mongolia, but is rather questionable when one has results that could affect the future of 8 billion people. And with that, let me turn it back to Peter.
Thanks, Herb. Yeah, James Hansen has certainly been doing some great work, both from the science point of view and the sociological aspects, I guess, what you would call it. So I just want to go back and just repeat, because it is definite that the report says that we have already triggered several tipping points at 1.5 degrees C, and going above 1.5 degrees C, the risk of those tipping points happening is going to increase exponentially. Tragically, we're in a partly self-imposed climate change runaway situation. The reason for that is that for the past couple of days, the global temperature from Copernicus has actually again gone above the huge 2024 global warming record. That's why I use this term runaway now, because we really have to use a strong term, because all of our governments are doing worse than nothing, right? They're all still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. We have the second biggest economy in the world in total denial of climate change. And I should mention one final thing about that, because one of the things that the new administration purged, of course, was the EPA. And the EPA did, in 2023, do an updated cost benefit. Now, cost benefit is a very important term here. I don't like it, but at the end of the day, the governments always make their decision on cost benefit. So ETA, this is an upgraded assessment. Sorry, this is an upgraded assessment. 2023, they get CO2 at 200 for a 2% discount rate. Obviously, there should be no discount rate on for future generations on climate change, climate disruption. But they do methane and they do nitrous oxide. Oh my God, methane, because as they explain, is very much more powerful than CO2, and it's actually being released every day. They get methane up to $1,000 a metric ton. So that's great, great work. I mean, that's a huge difference to those numbers of what we're being given for cost benefit.
Thanks, Peter. And your point about a discount rate, it's fairly obscure as a concept, but it's so critically important. And I urge those who are watching to look into the role of the discount rate that it plays in deciding what kinds of projects are approved and not approved, and how much we value the future versus how much we value the present. I want to go back briefly to the report again, and I want to mention, just ticking off very quickly, a few of the factors that they say should be included in risk analysis that now are largely not included. And each one of these that I'm going to mention is probably worth a program on its own. So, but this will just be mentioning them. One is that we look at the whole poly crisis, all of the aspects there, which deal with inequality, which deal with disinformation, which deal with authoritarianism, and they all relate to what the risk is, not just the CO2 concentrations. And that's part of being systemic, that we don't always put the human beings at the center of everything, that we also look at the role of nature and the survival of nature, both for our benefit and inherently there. That we basically look at uncertainty as a means of action rather than a means of avoiding action. So right now, basically, it's like, well, we're not completely certain that the world's going to collapse, so let's keep doing what we're doing for a few more years. And rather than, oh my goodness, we've got a 20, 30, 50% chance of collapse. We need to act right now. I mean, it's a different mindset. And it's a mindset that an actuary or a corporation that's well governed would choose to employ or so. And also, of course, and we've talked about this many times in this program, that these impacts are non-linear, that they keep going linear and linear until all of a sudden they don't, and then they escalate existentially or otherwise, and it's often too late. So with all those additional sort of dimensions of risk, I want to turn it back to Paul.
Yes, thank you. So getting back to these reinsurance companies, a very interesting peer-reviewed paper came out recently that specifically looked at what the two biggest ones in the world, Munich Re and Swiss Re, did as far as climate change. And it turns out that from the 70s, 80s, 90s on, they had climate units basically, or geo Earth units that so they hired climate scientists and mathematicians and statisticians and because they had to set policies and they're in the business to make money, so they have to set their insurance rates high enough to the insurance companies that then in turn set their own rates to their customers to continue to generate a profit, even though the extreme weather events were increasing. So they tracked it very carefully. They did their own research. They kept huge databases on so-called natural disasters, and the ones relating to climate were in the category, of course, atmospheric derived disasters, like, various storms, hailstorms, lightning storms, massive wind events, etc. So they kept huge databases on those, which they then disseminated mostly within the reinsurance industry. So they knew a lot of things that were going on, and they followed the public debates. Is it happening? Is it not happening? But they didn't participate too much. And I mean, they did have their own internal meetings. They did have some meetings, but they weren't geared. They were geared as a company to make money for their industries, but their databases on, for example, disasters around the world were unparalleled by anybody else. They actually did when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, first started producing their reports, their assessment reports, the reinsurance companies did not like those reports at all because they thought that the IPCC reports were far too conservative. And it took basically a number of reports before the IPCC reports, which of course is a consensus basis, mostly from the scientists, to determine that yes, we were getting a rapid increase in extreme weather events from climate change. In the first number of reports, they said, well, it could happen, but it probably won't happen. It's probably, there's probably some sort of connection. And finally, the IPCC reports did make the strong connections between climate change, global warming, and extreme weather events. And, the reinsurance companies thought that all along. They also did have some political sway sort of behind the scenes. So it's interesting because this paper it goes into a deep dive into what the actual insurance companies knew and what their reports and their internal meetings, and they basically priced things in their industry knowing full well how climate change was proceeding. So the accelerations, et cetera, they were all projected. Early on, we didn't get this polar amplification where the poles are warming much faster than the rest of the planet. That only took off later, but the models back in the 80s even projected that the Arctic would warm like 5 times faster than the rest of the planet. So I mean, this sort of thing now, now I think the accepted number is 4. For the longest time, scientists were saying 2 to 3 times, and I was always saying, well, it's higher than 2 to 3 times. That's nonsense. The number is actually 4, 5 to 7 times faster in the the warming in reality, depending on which latitude you define the Arctic as. So basically, and of course, this is the main factor in the disruption of the jet streams and the great increase in extreme weather events that we're seeing around the planet. These planetary tipping points, of course, probably the ones that James Hansen is most worried about is the AMOC, of course, because the AMOC, we're putting so much fresh water into the North Atlantic from increased rainfall, from increased melt rates. We're getting stratification of the ocean. We have this cold blob there, which is sticking out like a sore thumb. We're going to lose the AMOC probably within a decade or two, and then the southern hemisphere will warm like crazy, the equator will warm like crazy, and the melt rates from Antarctica will increase at much greater rates, and the reduction of melt rates from the Arctic, from Greenland, so sea level rise will rise several meters very quickly. So this is exactly where we're heading. So that will affect everything on the planet. So it's good to see reports actually having more reality in them, like this planetary solvency report from Exeter.
Well, thanks, Paul. So I want to thank both Peter and Paul for your contributions today in helping to describe both the substance of this report and its implications and the connections, like with the reinsurance industry. Before I wrap up, I just want to make a couple quick comments. Number one, I've read, I don't say this boastingly, I wish I was doing other things with my life, but I've read hundreds of these climate reports, and this has to be in the top handful in terms of its importance and its clarity. So this is not some super technical report with, lots of quadratic equations and all the rest of it and 8 syllable words and whatever, though there may be a few of those in there. So I really want to encourage everyone who's watching to download the report. It'll be, shown below. And to, even if you don't read the whole report, read the executive summary. But I'd also like to ask you to go one step further, and that is send the report to a friend, to a neighbor, or even better, to your council member, your mayor, your governor, your province, head, your member of parliament, whomever. And, with a note basically saying, that this is not like almost every other report that you get to read. This has to do with the future of humanity, the future of the planet, and the future of your own kids. Please take a look at it and act accordingly. So with that, again, I want to thank Paul and Peter today. And I want to, again, encourage you to like this channel, to subscribe to the channel, to basically take our videos here and send them on to other folks. to leave your comments on what we've done and what you would like us to do. And as always, we look forward to seeing you next week at the Climate Emergency Forum.